Howdy, folks. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today, for you folks, I'm going to be talking about Dungeons and Dragons. And today's subject is actually, well, it's only going to sort of lightly cover Dungeons and Dragons because today's video is actually talking about 6 RPGs other than Dungeons and Dragons. Now, there's going to be a couple things here that are going to be snippets. One, I've actually had to have played the game sort of extensively. That way, I had like a good baseline and acquirement of the rules to even recommend that it would be worth trying out. Did I like the setting? Is another series of rules, which some of them was really easy for me to get into the setting because of just my personal interest. The next thing is obviously it has to be actually fairly easy to acquire. May it be through PDF format or actually being able to buy a book on eBay, which all these you can easily buy. Well, either eBay or Amazon or whatever source, but essentially all of these you can get as physical copies, which is also kind of one of my requirements when it comes to role playing games. I prefer to have actual books and physical copies, especially if it's going to be a book part of that role playing game that I'm going to be using extensively. All right, so let's get on into it here, and I'm going to kick off the first one with a Cyberpunk role playing game. Now, this is not the holy grail of Cyberpunk. This is Carbon 2185 by Dragon Turtle Games. It's a D20 format, but it's more of a 5th edition format. So for those of you who play Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, you're going to be pretty familiar with the rules for Carbon, and it's actually going to be fairly easy for you to pick up and understand how to play Carbon 2145. Now, with that being said, it does have supplements, but realistically, you only need the core rulebook to play this. So it's not really a bad game, and honestly, when it kind of leads to a more darker looking, darker feeling cyberpunk game universe. But there's another cyberpunk role playing game I'm going to be recommending here in a little bit that I think is a better option, but I do also recommend Carbon 2145. I don't think it's a bad option, especially because this also expands out into Europe as well as Tokyo and some other parts of the world. So it's kind of a cyberpunk world as a whole. And that might allude to the other cyberpunk role-playing game I am just talking about as well. So let's move on to the next one I recommend on the list. And by the way, folks, these are in no order. But the next one is the World of Superheroes with Champions. Now, this is the Champions Complete version, and that's because Champions Complete really has enough to work with. Now, that being said, I do have a lot of source books, and a lot of the source books for this game I have on PDF, but I actually have a printed copy of Champions Complete itself, and that's the way I recommend getting Champions is like getting the core rule book as a printed copy, and then and of course you want Champions Complete, and then getting your source books separate because if you want to do things like I do, where you really don't use a lot of the pre-made assets, but you kind of need a guide to make different types of things and to build out your own universe. That is honestly the way to go, and that's kind of why I liked Champions. Now, Champions is not the oldest superhero RPG. However, it is not the first superhero RPG. But with that being said, it is now the oldest superhero RPG. The very first one that actually Champions was based off of is no longer around. Now, there's a lot of cool things about Champions versus other tabletop role playing games out there. First off, everything is done with D6s. Your skills, your attributes, everything is done by D6s. Ability checks is done by D6s. Your damage rolls is done by D6s. Your hit rolls is done by D6s. And then instead of gaining experience points, well, you still kind of gain experience points, but you don't gain levels. So what happens is you gain experience points and then you trade those experience points to make your character better. Maybe improve attributes, add new powers, improve powers that you already have, things of that nature. And honestly, it makes for a really great, really fun game. And if you're into the whole superhero comic book genre, this is honestly the very best superhero role playing game out there, especially if you want to do something where it's you're creating your heroes and villains from scratch, or even if you want to take something that kind of already exists, like say you want to create Wonder Woman, they got information in there essentially on how to create Wonder Woman because like the information for like her lasso of truth is actually in the Champions Complete rulebook. So it even tells you how to create this stuff on paper essentially and make it work. And honestly, it's a great fun game, like I said, if you're into the superhero genre. If you're not, I wouldn't recommend this game then. But moving on to the next one. Now we're going to go into the sci fi with the best version of the Star Trek, a Star Trek role playing game ever made, or at least in my opinion. Now, the fastest Star Trek was really good. With that being said, though, Star Trek Adventure still has some really advanced rules while keeping the game easy and streamlined enough for playability. And there's a lot of things I really liked that was done in Star Trek Adventures. Now, with that being said, I did forget to mention the creator of the game, and that is Mod. Okay, I always screw this up. I'm pretty sure I'm going to screw this up again. Modifius. And they make other games. They actually make a Fallout tabletop RPG as well as a few others. But this is the one I know the best from them. As well, this is the only one I have from them. And literally, I got started with the core rule book, and just as I started playing it, I just wanted more and more. And I started getting the other source books and the adventure modules. And suddenly, this turned into like some crazy tabletop role playing game addiction that I got kind of like I have with Dungeons and Dragons, where suddenly it's like, oh my god, I got to have all the source material. Just a solid overall role playing game. The mechanics are very different, starting with the fact that when you're creating your character, it's like a career life path deal where it includes your upbringing, and based on how your upbringing's done is what bonuses you get to what stats and what your stats turn out to be, and then it gets into your education system and that might fluctuate how your stats are and just things of that nature. It's just a really interesting system. It's not an experience based system as well. It's kind of more of an ad hoc system, if you will. Or sorry, uh, no, sorry, I got that wrong. It's not ad hoc. I don't know why I said ad hoc. It is a milestone based system, but it's also got guidelines for what that milestone system is. And it's actually a really simple experience system. Well, it's not even really experience. It's just kind of like, here you've been in so many sessions. Here's an upgrade point. You know, everybody decided that it's not now this is the cool part is um the players after so many sessions they vote for who they think like the essentially the MVP player is, and they get an additional point towards improving their character, and it's decided on by everybody, the game master and the players as well. Everybody kind of votes on it, so that's kind of a cool way of doing that, because then it kind of reflects things. Although that could cause some issues, which I'll get into in a different video. I'm not going to get into with this one. But the way the mechanics are set up, like I said, simple, streamlined, but you can, it's easy, fairly easy to understand the rules. It doesn't get really too crazy, but I like how it talks about the gaming sessions as episodes and the different things that the players do, and how to do the different things and how to work together as a team to essentially achieve goals. And it's just really cool. And it's a really dynamic way of setting up Star Trek. And honestly, like I said, when it comes to a Star Trek RPG, I've played FASAs, I've played Last Unicorn Games version. There was also one from Decipher, which was, God, that was horrible. And then this one here, and this is just the best of the RPGs in my opinion. But let's move on to the next one. Okay, now we got one here from Watsy, and I'll get into why here in a bit, and you'll probably understand why as I go through because of my kind of addiction to Dungeons and Dragons, if you will. And that is Call of Cthulhu. Now, this is the D20 version of Call of Cthulhu, and it's a nice, really well done horror game. The hit points are kept low. You have a D6 for your hit points, and so that kind of makes you feel weak because pretty much there's a lot of creatures in the game that can kill you in one shot. Uh, you can have it set for a modern setting as well as like the Roaring 20 settings, which is kind of more like what H.P. Lovecraft would want. Uh, Doing it how H.P. Lovecraft would want it. And it adds it takes like the earlier like 3.0 mechanics that what like D&D had, and it adds horror elements to it. It adds basically sanity effects and things of that nature. And it adds like a lot of magic items. It makes a lot of references to H.P. Lovecraft's work. And it's just great overall. It's with the sanity rolling and the sanity rules and with how threatening the creatures really are, you don't ever feel like you become an overpowered character. Actually, it feels like a job and a half just to survive. So actually, you avoid combat as much as you can because of the lack of hit points, especially at first, and with how powerful some of the creatures are. And it just really, really leans heavily into H.P. Lovecraft's work. The next thing is it's one book. There's no source books, there's no adventures or anything. You have to create it yourself through the book. So you got to figure out what kind of story you want to tell, things of that nature. It leads to you being the primary source of creativity. The next thing about Call of Cthulhu is it leans itself into creating other role playing games as well. I actually created a homebrew Roaring 20s game where essentially the group played as the mafia and we were doing illegal criminal activities, running booze as the mafia, trying to avoid the police and so on and so forth. And it was actually really enjoyable. And Call of Cthulhu made that happen for us, as well as we also had a homebrew Resident Evil system based on the Call of Cthulhu rules. Now, with that being said, there's another snippet that's really cool about Call of Cthulhu. In the book, there's of course the Cthulhu mythos. And the Cthulhu mythos actually converts over to Dungeons and Dragons 3.0. Now, of course, if you have 3.5, it still works. With 4th edition and 5th edition, I doubt it will work because of the bunch of the changes they made, especially to the skills and other things of that nature. But it's really cool that I could bring the great old one, the Cthulhu himself, to my Dungeons and Dragons realm, and it tells me how to do it and the stat changes and so on and so forth to make that happen. So this is kind of a double whammy type of game, as it's Call of Cthulhu itself, as well as it lends itself to Dungeons and Dragons, and I think that makes it a very great option. Now, the next one I want to talk about here is the daddy of them all. This is probably the oldest role playing game, or no? Okay, I don't know if it's the oldest role playing game, but it's the oldest cyberpunk role playing game out there and the biggest cyberpunk role playing game out there. This is Cyberpunk 2020. Now, I've looked over the rules for Cyberpunk Red. I can also recommend Cyberpunk Red, and in some ways, I think Cyberpunk Red is actually better than Cyberpunk 2020. The nice thing is, though, too, is a lot of the stuff is cross compatible. So there's quite a bit there in the source books from Cyberpunk 2020 that actually does work for Cyberpunk Red. The only reason I'm recommending Cyberpunk Red or Cyberpunk 2020 and not Cyberpunk Red, though, is because of my experience with Cyberpunk 2020. I generally lack experience with Cyberpunk Red. So that's why I'm recommending 2020 and not Red. Now, this is from all our Talsarian Games. I probably pronounced that wrong too. Sorry, folks. I'm old as shit. I can be really bad at pronunciations at times. But with that being said, this brings the cyberpunk genre to life on your tabletop experience. And this is one of my favorite genres of science fiction. You can do Neuromancer. You can do Blade Runner. You can do Judge Dredd. This game is set up that you can do any form of cyberpunk you want to. Ghost in the Shell, you can do it. And that's how this game is made. Now, with that being said, Cyberpunk 2020 has its own universe. But literally, and this is even from Mike Pondsmith, who created Cyberpunk 2020. Essentially, you can take and throw out those rules and the source material, do what you want to do with it, and create your own cyberpunk universe with it. And that's how he created the game. He created the game to give you rules, ideas, and baselines, and pretty much decided if you want to play Cyberpunk the way I play Cyberpunk, here's how it's done. If you want to play Cyberpunk your own way, create your world and have at it. And that is actually one thing I can really give Mike Pondsmith. He was a game designer that left people a lot of creative room and a lot of freedom, and pretty much just set them, kind of gave people pointers to go in the right direction. And the last one is actually a rules light game. I'm not really too into rules light games, but I think Gallant Knight Games has the right idea here with Mecca and Monsters. Now, this is part of their Tiny Frontier series, but what's really cool with what they did with Mecca and Monsters is you can either use Mecca and Monsters with Tiny Frontiers, or you can do it the way I do it and use Mecca and Monsters as its own role-playing game. I actually don't have the Tiny Frontiers books. I only have Mecca and Monsters. And what's really cool is essentially you can take it and you can create a universe of taking giant war machines and putting it up against giant kaiju like monsters like Godzilla or Mothra or King Ghidorah, whatever. And, that's what this game lends itself to, and it does itself in a rules light format. It kind of gives you more or less a Pacific Rim type of feel. And, it's just a battle royale of taking giant walking battle mechs and fighting giant monsters. And of course, with a very cunning game master, you can come up with some interesting story with the game. And it just makes it's a game based on being pure fun and just trying to focus more on fun and lack mechanics in the process, which is what a rules light game is. It's also a fairly cheap game to get into. So personally, I actually recommend checking this one out. It's all, if I remember correctly, it's been a while since I played. It's all done with D6s once again. So not a real hard game to get into because D6s are very easy to come by. But anyway, folks, that is going to be my video today of 6 role-playing games I recommend that is not Dungeons and Dragons, but is relatable somehow to Dungeons and Dragons. Anyway, folks, thank you very much for tuning in. Hopefully you all enjoyed the video and have yourself a wonderful day.